Hello and welcome to Compassionate Schools, TIC in Action. This is episode 5, Wendy.
Can't believe we're already on episode
Yeah.
5. It's kind of gone by a little fast.
This is the one with the voice.
Mm.
The one with voice. Welcome.
All right, so we're the part of the district mental health team, and we'll be hosting this podcast for you today. I'm Wendy Belfield. I'm over there on the right.
And I'm Linda Hughes. I'm on the left.
That would be the opposite of the right, the other
only
choice.
other option.
Yes.
Yes.
We put our pictures up there, so and actually we'll show our picture on each slide for whoever's talking. Since we can't do face-to-face presentations now, we at least thought it would be nice to match a face to a voice while you're working your way through the podcast. So that's why our pictures are there.
So today we're talking about trauma-informed care, which is in the context of compassionate schools. We're going to review cultural competence and intersectionality, and we're going to walk through prevention, intervention, and restoration using those trauma-sensitive practices.
Okay, so like we said at the beginning, this episode is focused on voice. In our trauma-informed care tenets or principles, we sort of often group voice and choice together because together voice and choice are very empowering and give us each a sense of being heard and respected and part of things. And if we think about it, like what it's like in our own lives when we're not given voice or not given choice, and then the difference it makes when we are. So even though voice and choice are paired up together a lot of times, today we're going to focus primarily on the one aspect of voice and what that would mean for ourselves and for our students. So we want to take a minute to revisit the concepts of cultural competency and intersectionality. We've been weaving those concepts through all of our presentations and podcasts. These concepts are going to continue to feature significantly in the work that we do because they're such an important component of creating safe and engaging learning environments. So we want to make sure that we're always making an effort to maintain a conscious awareness of these things until eventually, hopefully, they just become an unconscious part of our practices. So one of the very first steps to becoming a culturally competent educator is to raise our awareness around our own cultural connections and how those connections shape the way we view the world and the people around us. The goal here is to begin to really peel back the layers of identities and connections that make us all human, and to acknowledge that those cultural identities and connections influence the way we see, experience, and understand the world around us.
So walking through, right there, there's a definition of intersectionality, but walking through a little mini review of that and what that means, remember the analogy of an accelerator and brakes. There are a lot of layers to a person's identity, and some things give us privilege. That's the accelerator that makes things easier. And other aspects of identity can feel like there are brakes on when we're trying to move forward. If someone made a whole lot of assumptions about us, even with the best of intentions, because of one part of our identity, they would certainly miss a lot, right? It doesn't matter if the aspect is something we think of as positive or a limitation or barrier. Defining a person by their first language, a talent they have, a learning disability or a strength, cultural identity or sexuality, education level, a physical limitation, or a unique trait, the color of a person's skin, or the size of their bank account, or their house. So understanding each person's identity it's really a combination of these accelerators and brakes that can give us a clearer understanding of both the impact of discrimination and of privilege.
Yeah, I like that analogy a lot of sort of the accelerator and the brake. We use privilege and discrimination a lot of times,
Yeah.
and that's really kind of hard to wrap your head around what that means, especially when we don't really feel privileged around an aspect of our identity. So I like this idea of accelerator and brakes as a way to understand intersectionality. Well done, Linda.
Thanks,
Oh,
Wendy.
you're welcome. So here we are again, continuing to revisit a slide that we see in all of our podcasts or presentations, and we'll continue to weave them through all of our episodes. This came from an interview with Alicia Keys about her book, More Myself. During that interview, she was asked about a particular quote, this quote that you see on your screen here, where she said, "We shift ourselves not in sweeping pivots, but in movements so tiny that they're hardly perceptible." And her explanation about what she meant by that just really stuck with me. So, what she said was she was referring to her own experience as a child at school when she was trying to fit in and be liked and accepted. And years went by before she realized that she didn't have a sense of self beyond the messages that she received from the people around her, because the adjustments that she made to herself, like her clothes and her speech and her hair, were just a series of little tiny movements towards a cultural norm that she sort of unconsciously thought made her like everyone else or made her normal. And those adjustments happened so subtly and so subconsciously that she just failed to recognize that it was happening. And really nobody around her saw it either, because it was just so imperceptible. So, in our minds, as we're wanting to talk about cultural competence and wanting to talk about intersectionality and being mindful of the diversity that's across our county and in our schools, we want to take this idea of tiny movements as having a significant relevance to our own students and paying attention to the diversity and culture that they have, but also looking at, are there things that we can do as educators to make our own tiny movements towards being culturally competent, rather than thinking about it in this huge giant sweeping pivot towards one day we're not paying attention and the next day we're fully culturally competent and diverse in everything that we do.
That sort of sweeping change can be really overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's hard to know where to start. So maybe that's in the tiny movements, just
Perfect.
taking those steps.
Yeah, exactly. So if we can say to ourselves that we don't have to expect a sweeping pivot towards cultural competence, if we can make our own tiny movements, starting with inclusive ideas or inclusive behaviors, and being mindful about the subtle messages that we send to the children in our schools, that's a way that we're envisioning that we can start to make those changes or make those adjustments. So for this episode, let's think about this idea of diverse guest educators. So according to a 2015 study by the Economics of Education Review, students are often encouraged to work harder when they share a background with an educator, which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So and this study was actually completed using data sets that were provided by the Florida Department of Education. So this is information that's kind of from our own backyard. But even beyond working harder or raising achievement, which is, ultimately our goal, I think what Lynn and I have been exploring is that phenomenon that Alicia Keys talked about. This idea that when children don't see people who look like them or talk like them or dress like them in professions they respect or maybe aspire to become, then they start to make these little shifts in their minds. And maybe it's a shift in the way that they dress or talk. Maybe it's a shift in the way they view themselves, or maybe it's a shift in the way they think about the possibilities in front of them, like how far can I go and can I actually become this thing that I want to become. So maybe one tiny movement we can make in schools is to think about pursuing diverse guest educators, maybe as just part of a lesson plan that fits with a guest speaker, or maybe when we're planning for larger events like the Great American Teach-In. Either way, just considering how we ensure that all of our students see themselves represented in positive and inspiring ways can be a tiny movement that we could make towards being culturally competent.
Yeah, Wendy, that sort of pivot really does impact our students. And I think it's not just about the students in the minority that see themselves represented. It's also, I think, critical for the students in the majority to see that they are actually a part of a diverse world. So even if a classroom is mostly white students, it's important for those students to see representation from other backgrounds, so they're comfortable with diversity and that they have an experience of what diverse people are like.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes, even looking in the media or looking at what we see in magazines or on TV, sometimes even those versions of cultural minorities are not really accurate representations of what it means to be part of that culture. So I
Mm-hmm.
think about an interview I just heard recently with a former model who is Muslim and wears a hijab. And she was saying that as she moved along throughout being a model, the hijab that she was being asked to wear was really nothing like a hijab that she would wear for her culture. And she did it, and it was part of like whatever, photo shoots that she was wearing, that she was doing and participating in. But she was describing the materials that were being used, and the way that it was being set on her head was really not consistent with being Muslim and representative of that.
So it was like a fashion statement versus what it means to her spiritually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the perfect way to describe that. So that really kind of resonated with me, that even Muslim children looking at her in print are not really going to see what it means to be a Muslim model.
Mm.
And that eventually that reconciliation happened for her, and she said, I feel grateful for that opportunity to be out there, but I'm going to step away and try to represent who I am in a more authentic way.
Huh.
Yeah, it was interesting.
So there really is this stepping forward from a conceptual understanding of something to changing our practices when in the storm under stress. This image I think is great because there's this big bubble. So you can agree with something intellectually, change your understanding, and feel firm about that. But until it's in the storm, and you're actually um, moving forward with those practices under stressful conditions, you don't really know
Yeah.
what it's going to be like with your own stress response thrown into the equation.
Right.
So this isn't easy to take these steps. It's a process. Even if you've already done work with this and you see yourself as a culturally responsive teacher, educator, there still is potential for growth and still blind spots that we all have that we can keep examining.
Yeah, we talked about that in our last session, sort of this idea
Yeah.
of blind spots that really aren't intentional on our part. They just sort of develop over time subconsciously. But if we can bring those blind spots into our reality in our conscious mind, then we can maybe anticipate how we might respond under stress, and we can make conscious choices around those things.
Mm-hmm.
So, as we're continuing to talk about these tiny movements and these adjustments that we can make to become culturally competent educators and create safe, empowering, and equitable school communities, I continue to be drawn back to this slide. And you might remember we were talking about this call to action from the amazing Brene Brown, who has done decades of research on trauma, shame, and vulnerability. Here she's reminding us about the importance of creating psychologically safe spaces for our students. As she's pointing out, students who are being crushed by the weight of their armor will not be able to receive the high quality instruction or experience academic achievement until that armor is hanging on a rack. So for us, this question becomes how? We already talked about one way, right? Our culturally competent tiny movement that can help set the stage and send subtle messages to our students. But what about when we have to support a student whose armor is really getting in the way, not only of their own learning, but of our ability to provide instruction? Then what do we do? When this becomes less about sort of setting an environment that is safe and inclusive, and really targeting in on one case example.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that.
Let's dive in.
Let's dive in.
So Wendy, here's our opportunity to get real. Okay, you know that kind of student that sort of disappears into the background of the classroom. Maybe is quiet and solitary. Not a student maybe that fits societal norms, and their intersectionality might tick a couple of boxes, that might put on brakes
Mm-hmm.
in their lives, but they don't seem hugely unhappy. They certainly aren't disruptive. And so you kind of let them be
Mm-hmm.
because maybe you have a bigger fish to fry. They're, causing those disruptions. And that student might be intelligent, but maybe not academically engaged. So the grades might show underperforming. It's hard to meet everybody's needs, obviously, in a classroom. And isn't it sometimes necessary to kind of triage those needs and give your energy to students that directly pull your attention,
Mm-hmm.
especially ones that may be overtly disruptive, and that can be really challenging. So let's just pause for a moment with that kind of scenario and let something percolate. What is the value of giving and cultivating voice in our students? And what would be the investment? And not just putting out fires, but in creatively engaging the quiet, detached friends in the classroom. It can be these students that actually feel most isolated and alone. They're flying under the radar, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they might not even stand out as needing help. So I wonder what kind of effect it might have even on the more attention-seeking students if these quiet students got more of the attention.
Mm-hmm.
I wish we could have a little conversation right now, Wendy, with our listeners.
Yeah.
I would love to hear their anecdotes about this
Mm-hmm.
and maybe some situations that they've dealt with where they did invest or they struggled with the ones that are the disruptors. So if some juicy tidbits are popping up for you as you're listening to this, please jot down a thought you're having and drop that into our Padlet after this episode. We'd love to hear your experiences with this.
Yeah, this is an interesting scenario to review because typically when we're reviewing scenarios, we do talk about the kids that are drawing our attention, are disruptive, sort of interfere with our daily schedule or with the learning of other kids in the classroom. And so we start problem solving around how can we create a better flow? How can we ensure that everyone's getting access to the information and the supports that they need? This is one of those students that we would probably never problem solve at the school level.
Yeah.
It might be something that like an educator would think about or might be in the back of their mind, but would, like you said, we have to triage and prioritize. So this is the kind of kid that's really interesting to take a closer look at because we wouldn't normally do that.
Yeah, and sometimes these are the students that might pop up with a Baker Act because they might be having a crisis and they're so good at sustaining and maybe not getting your attention because that's been a survival skill that they've had. So they might pop up in that capacity, but from a teacher perspective,
yeah,
they're not going to disrupt your flow. They're not going to interfere with getting through your content, and so it makes sense that you're trying to figure out how to balance those needs.
Yeah, and as a teacher, you might not even know that they've popped up with a Baker Act or popped up with something, that seems like inconsistent with who they are in your classroom. So it does sort of speak to when we're triaging or when we're taking that sort of wide angle view of the class, to include everybody in that, even if that might not be like your priority, still get to every single student in front of you in some capacity or another with regard to connection. Yeah. So we might not even see this child as having armor, that might not even be how we classify it. But for the purposes of this conversation today, we're going to view this child through that lens of having some armor up. Their armor just happens to be quite a bit more adaptable. So it's like almost like camouflaged armor, right? So it's not that blatant. And so they're fitting in even though their armor is up. So if we still apply that sort of mindset and this expanded view of ourselves to increase opportunities to connect with even students that aren't challenging, but are there with some breaks that we've noticed, like some of those, like you said, those sort of checking off a couple of boxes that might be a little bit of breaks, raising our awareness, expanding our view of what that might look like, and then how might we engage in some prevention. And maybe that's what this is about. Maybe it's a lot about prevention, but it's also some intervention as well, so there's some action that we might take, but really thinking about the prevention part of it. So how do we prevent things from getting worse? How do we make sure that we're creating an environment that is welcoming, deploying some intervention, some action steps we can take, and then restoration in the event that restoration is necessary? What might that look like? So we're going to take ourselves through all three of these things through the lens of this one particular student. So starting with prevention, one of the things that we could do is create different opportunities for those sort of shy or anxious, or those kids that sort of fit into the background, use their voice in the classroom, which is a great way to cultivate a learning environment where there are fewer barriers to engagement, connection, and learning. So when we look at prevention, we're looking at sort of the things we already have in place, and we're looking at ways that we might use some of these prevention techniques to cultivate a larger environment where this student and students like him or her would benefit. It also helps to show students that might act out to get attention that there are other ways to draw your focus. So if we're giving attention to students that are we do that thing where we give verbal praise to kids that are doing what we want them to do, rather than sort of pointing out in the kids that aren't doing what we want them to do. And that's like an intentional effort to shift, that behavior. So, that's how I get attention. And that really works for the attention seekers, and so a student like this who's not attention seeking, but still, providing them with opportunity to engage and connect, that is also, it benefits that child and it benefits the rest of your classroom, just as a model. So think about some ways right now that you've maybe used to engage and give voice to students who would benefit from feeling more empowered, and maybe using their voice, but they're not comfortable taking that initiative. If you have suggestions or strategies, please make a note right now for yourself, and then later after this episode's over, if you would put that onto our Padlet so that we can just start cataloging some of those strategies and ideas and share with other folks.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. So intervention, that first step is kind of holding up a mirror and checking in with ourselves, knowing what our buttons are, what unmet need might cause us to feel dysregulated. And when you invest in a student that isn't being disruptive or asking for your assistance, does that sometimes leave you maybe feeling a couple of steps behind at the time, and then you wonder, is this worth it? I'm already stretched, and I'm giving some of my energy and time to the student that isn't calling out for it. So if you're feeling like you're being asked to fix something maybe that doesn't appear to be that broken, it's like engaging with a student that isn't disruptive. When you feel like, I've already got so much territory to cover with this academic content, how does that feel? Just pausing and thinking about, what are we suggesting here? Right. What can you tell yourself when you do make this shift? What do you tell yourself in your mind that helps you regain your balance when you're pushing yourself to make some of those changes, to maybe play that long game, where you invest your attention because you know it's best practice, even though it's not easy and it feels a little bit uncomfortable, especially at the beginning of establishing that connection.
Yeah.
So intervention, the second part is then what do you do? Students that slip between the cracks, like the student could, can really feel quietly hurt or angry about it, not feeling taken care of, nobody cares, feeling just disconnected. So taking those moments to invest in that ongoing conversation, facilitating organic chosen connections with peers. So you very intentionally pair the student to build connection. Think about creative ways for students to share. Sometimes those students that sit very quietly have some anxiety, have some social anxiety, and it's hard for them to be given attention in front of peers. So you want to be able to give them maybe some options on how they present. Things that I've used before are they are allowed to record presentations, to incorporate electronic posts and comments rather than raising their hand for participation, to do quick shares in community circles where a student picks a question or knows the question beforehand, so they get to preview that to prepare what their answer is going to be, and think about what they'd actually like to share. Consider connecting with their caregivers and about positives so that you build that connection with home and really boost the students' feelings of confidence. Teachers have a secret superpower that will fundamentally, alter a student's life. You can totally change the trajectory of a student's life by that relationship. So empowering students to develop confidence and use their voice, which is what this episode is about, right, Wendy?
Nice connection. I think about, as you were talking, and I was thinking about, this is actually a really great connection to some SEL skills and benchmarks. So as the SEL trainings and content is coming out, and teachers are being asked to develop lesson plans and think about the SEL benchmarks and standards, what you were describing in this intervention could be easily achieved through some SEL lesson planning, like even the interpersonal standard that's out there, a benchmark, where there's this expectation that students know how to work with one another in a meaningful way and have those meaningful connections. So I can see how a lot of what we're talking about, really in all of our sessions, but in this session in particular, you could really be checking off a lot of boxes by using SEL lesson plans to achieve this same thing. So it might not feel then, like you said a few minutes ago, you might be reflecting and saying, why would I spend my most valuable resource, which is time, on a student that is really doing fine, or appears to be doing fine. And so if that's part of the barrier, one of the things that might help with that would be to think of it through the SEL lens. Like that's something that could benefit this child, and just be paying attention to how that particular child, or really all the children, are responding to those things. So
I like that connection, Wen. So restoration. I just want to kind of come back to that emotional bank account. And it's really healthy as an adult to acknowledge that you have your own priorities, the pressures that are on you regarding expectations. You have your own buttons, and take the time to get your balance if you're struggling with matching your values to your teaching practices. I think that's a struggle for a lot of people right now, because things are more stretched and more stressful. So trying to meet current or past expectations in current situation is sometimes really challenging. Students do best and they take responsibility for their own actions better when they feel legitimately cared about. And so that's the power of building that connection. Because educators can be so rushed for time and to get through the content, restoration, this step, is the thing that often gets either rushed or skipped. And it may come in stages as you build that connection. If we think about brain chemistry, to pull someone out of their shell because the student is kind of protective in the way that they open up, they're not showing all of their personality, they're not actively engaging in things, there is a need to build trust and safety. And so this is what pays off in the long run for a student like this to create that. And personally, my mantra during parenting my own kids and over many years as a counselor is I'm investing in that long game, building those relationships, even though those steps might take up front that energy, it does pay off.
Yeah, for sure. And it's hard, I think, sometimes to really think about that investment through an educator's lens because we have these students for, like 8 months, 9,
Yeah.
10 months.
Yeah.
And so when we think about that, it's hard to think of like the long game, but in reality, we are all like, we're scaffolded supports, right,
Yes.
in that child's long game.
Yeah.
And so each of us has that role to play in that scaffolding. And so creating those supports for the next person and the next person is a part of that long game. And those 10 months are critical.
Yeah.
And if we do connect, I think about even for myself, like I think about like passwords, for some of my technology that I have. And I probably use 3 different passwords our teachers that I had in elementary and high school.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and so it's I say that to say that's sort of that secret superpower you're referring to.
Yeah.
Is there are certain teachers that stuck with me through all my years of education, all the way through college, that I would say those teachers had an impact on me. I just never forgot them. I couldn't tell you what I learned in their class beyond just the basics, but I just remember feeling super connected to that teacher or that classroom. And so they end up being like a password on my bank account. And that's like my like subtle way of,
that's cool.
Yeah, of saying, hey, you're, respect. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. That's the secret superpower.
I love that.
Become someone's password.
That's the goal.
Yeah,
the
exactly.
legacy.
The legacy.
We hope that you as a listener, that you're able to slow down and pause and smell the roses sometimes, no matter what you are going through personally. Work is only part of what you do. That's a nod to intersectionality. You're not just an educator. There's a lot of other parts of who you are and that make up your identity and your life. So you may be going through a particularly bumpy time, or maybe you've been around others who are, and you are the person that they lean on. Remember those deposits that we've talked about before. The deposits, know what refuels you, and double check where your boundaries are. If you're going into the red, remember the EAP. It's a great benefit that we all have, and it can really take the pressure off to be able to use your voice fully with somebody that you don't have to filter things for.
So we introduced this graphic in our very first session, and we've carried it through all of our sessions as a way to kind of wrap things up and remind ourselves of the bigger picture. And we used a plant to demonstrate sort of that intricate and interdependent relationship between the district priorities that support our goal of creating compassionate schools. And as now we're wrapping up our 4th session, we're starting, hopefully, to really see how the knowledge, understanding, and application of trauma-informed practices are really integral to how we nourish our school communities. And our growth is dependent on our ability to make connections, foster healthy relationships, and thrive together. So it's really how we activate our trauma-sensitive mindset and apply our knowledge that we're truly going to evolve our relationships with our students and our colleagues. And really, that's how we'll transform our school communities.
Wendy, you had mentioned that we're wrapping up our 4th session, but this is actually our 5th.
What? It's our 5th session.
Yeah.
The time is flying by.
Well, it flies when you're having fun.
That must be it. It's got nothing to do with my brain, obviously. All right, so remember to access the other training materials for this session. We'll have, I think this time we have a video that we can watch as a resource, and then we also have our vignette that we'll attach here on the My Learning page as well. That's going to dive a little bit further into our tiny movement. And then post a comment or a question to the discussion board or to the Padlet or to the Padlet. in order to receive in-service points for the session. So we want to hear from you first and foremost, but the way we know that you've completed or gone through the session so that we can award an in-service point is when we hear back from you, that you've posted a question or a comment, and then we can go ahead and award that in-service point.
And we love reading those.
Yeah, we do get a big kick out of reading those, and it really does fill our bucket to read them and know that folks are enjoying or even questioning some of the stuff that we have. And you can see what everybody else has done. Like you can read as you go into the Padlet or you go into the discussion posts. Everyone can see the comments that are made. So for the remainder of the school year, we'll continue to add new training sessions each month. So we have, since we're on 5, not 4, we'll have 2 more after this, one for April and one for May. And we'll build on all the concepts that we've been talking about. So please continue to revisit this course to discover new content, and use the link to our Padlet to let us know if there's specific scenarios that you would like us to highlight or review.
And share with your friends so they can chime in as well and start the conversation, make it bigger.
Yeah, exactly. We love to grow the conversation. So that's all we have for you for today. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope to see you soon.
Take care and be safe.